Thank you, Madam President, women and men of the Senate. It is the power and proper duty of a representative body to look diligently into every affair of government and to talk much about what it sees. It is meant to be the eyes and the voice and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents. The only really self-governing people is that people which discusses and interrogates its administration. And that quote is from United States versus Rumley, citing Woodrow Wilson, Congressional Government, a Study in American Politics. Ultimately, Madam President, this bill is about power, not my power or your power, but our power. Our power as elected members of the legislative branch of government, a separate but co-equal branch of government, as provided by the Constitution of the State of Maine. The legislative branch of government is described first in Article 4, Part 1st and Part 2nd. Its powers are described next in Article 4, Part 3rd, for a total of 13 pages. All of this comes before Article 5, Part 1st, which describes executive power in all of 4.5 pages. This bill is vital to the ability of the legislature to wield its power to conduct oversight of the executive branch. All of us here have been elected and entrusted by our constituents to ensure that government works for the people. However, the recent law court ruling in the Government Oversight Committee versus the Department of Health and Human Services has severely restricted our ability to do that work. And Madam President, I wish to just read some of the concurring opinion of that ruling from Justice Rick E. Lawrence into the record, because it is not the controlling opinion of the court, of course. But as with lots of minority reports, there's always something in them worth digesting. And I do believe that Justice Rick Lawrence understood what we just read into the record around the power of the legislature. And so he reads, and this has been distributed to every member so that no one can assume that I am putting words in this man's mouth. He obviously was confirmed by us a couple of years ago. He wrote the governor a letter, asked the governor to appoint him to the court. She said yes. He got through the committee process, and we confirmed him as the first black person to ever serve on the law court. He writes in his concurring opinion, I agree with the court's determination that the committee was not entitled to the confidential records at the time of its subpoena. Where I part ways with the court's opinion is that it goes too far in concluding that the committee is never authorized to seek and, if necessary, demand the production of confidential information like the department's Child Protective Service records. Child Protective Records. Quote, the fundamental objective in interpreting statutes is to determine the intent of the legislature in enacting them and to give effect to that intent. End quote. We interpret a statute's language, quote, to avoid absurd, illogical, or inconsistent results and attempt to give all of its words meaning, end quote. The citations are in the document. I will not read those into the record. As a general rule, words and phrases that are not expressly defined in the statute, quote, must be given their plain and natural meaning and should be construed according to their natural import in common and approved usage, end quote. Skipping ahead, the court looks to dictionary definitions to help determine the ordinary meaning of words in a statute. See, for example, Searle versus Town of Bucksport. In looking for the plain meaning, we view the relevant provisions in the context of the entire statutory scheme to generate a harmonious result, end quote. This court, quote, should not read a statute to conflict with another statute when an alternative reasonable interpretation yields harmony, end quote, emphasis added. If a statute is unambiguous, we interpret the statute directly without examining legislative history. We look to legislative history and other extraneous aids in interpretation of a statute only when we have determined that the statute is ambiguous, end quote, meaning that it is, quote, reasonably susceptible to different interpretations, end quote. As the court's opinion states, OPEGA was created, quote, for the purpose of providing program evaluation of agencies and programs of state government. Because of the nature and scope of its charge, OPEGA requires and is afforded full access to agency records, including confidential information. The committee was established as a, quote, joint legislative committee to oversee program evaluation and government accountability matters, emphasis added. The committee directs and oversees OPEGA's work pursuant to the provisions of the committee's enabling statute. Black's Law Dictionary defines matter as a subject under consideration. Black's Law Dictionary, here, the subject under consideration is the deaths of 4 children who received Child Protective Services from the department. Therefore, the committee's role is to oversee OPEGA's investigation into the deaths of these 4 children. Now, the committee is not authorized to conduct independent investigations, audits, or program evaluations directly. However, given the plain language and the context of the statutory scheme, this lack of authorization does not preclude the committee from accessing confidential information pursuant to its statutory duties set out in Section 994. Section 994 provides that the information available to the committee is governed by A, the Rules for Legislative Investigations, Title III, Chapter 21, and B, the Freedom of Access Act, Title I, Chapter 13. The Rules for Legislative Investigations expressly provide for a legislative committee to be granted the power to, quote, issue subpoenas in connection with any study or investigation, end quote. For a committee-granted subpoena power to be deemed an investigative committee, and for an investigative committee to utilize an executive session to exclude the public from that session and the discussion of confidential matters. As a legislative committee granted subpoena power, the committee thus has the power to hold executive sessions to discuss confidential matters. FOA governs the information available to the committee via its subpoena power. FOA sets forth that it is the intent of the legislature that its actions be taken openly and that the records related to those public proceedings be open to public inspection. But FOA also makes clear that executive sessions are permitted in order to allow for private discussions of information contained in records made, maintained, or received by a body or agency when access by the general public to those records is prohibited by statute. FOA also defines both public records and confidential and privileged records, demonstrating that records may refer to both public and confidential records. Thus, it is clear that the committee may exercise its subpoena power with respect to both public and confidential information. Therefore, contrary to the contention of the court's opinion, the plain language of FOA does not expressly preclude the committee from accessing confidential information. And the rules for legislative investigations specifically contemplate this possibility by allowing for executive sessions to discuss confidential matters. In performing its duties relative to receipt of OPEGA's reports, the committee has the authority to conduct hearings. With respect to those hearings, the committee may seek information and the production of, quote, papers or records, including books, accounts, documents, computer disks, or memory or other electronic media, and other materials regardless of their physical or electronic form. And nothing in this portion of the enabling statute expressly precludes the committee's pursuit of confidential information. Moreover, if information sought by the committee is not provided, the committee may issue a subpoena for the production of that information. Again, nothing in the statute pertaining to the committee's authority to issue a subpoena precludes the use of the subpoena to obtain confidential information. Seeking the Child Protective Records to facilitate its determinations in regard to OPEGA's report would be entirely consistent with the committee's enabling statute. Such information may be needed for the committee to question public officials about OPEGA's findings and recommendations per Section 994, Paragraph 4, Subsection 4, or to determine whether to endorse OPEGA's recommendations per Section 994, Subsection 7. Such a request would allow the committee to act on its statutory duties and thus would not constitute an independent evaluation of the Department's Child Protective Services by the committee. The committee's pursuit of confidential information in this limited context would be more in line with the statutory posture of the Legislative Investigative Committee in Maine Sugar Industries Incorporated versus Maine Industrial Building Authority. Both matters involve a legitimate investigation into a subject matter clearly within the remit of the respective legislative committees. Although the committee cannot conduct its own investigation, the committee, like the one in Maine Sugar, has subpoena power that it may use to obtain confidential information in order to meet its legislative duties. In both instances, the subpoena serves as a legitimate legislative duty. In Maine Sugar, it was direct pursuit of an investigation, and here it is the prudent exercise of discretion to review OPEGA's report, determine whether or not what degree to endorse it, and decide whether to propose legislation to implement OPEGA's recommendations. Further, as was true of 10 MRSA Section 852 in Maine Sugar, the statute here that purportedly bars the committee's access to confidential information, Title 22 MRSA Section 4008, does not do so expressly. Fundamentally, the court's opinion contends that the language in 22 MRS Section 4008, subsection 3, paragraph D, is so awkwardly phrased it cannot be read to refer to the committee. Given the usual and customary way that the legislature organizes itself to do its work, however, it is entirely logical, unsurprising, and within the plain meaning of Section 4008 3D that the members of the committee fall within the ambit of this provision. The committee has clear authority over this substantive area of law as a result of the evaluation of child protective services conducted at the committee's behest. Similarly, although its authority is subject to durational limits, by directing, overseeing, and reviewing an evaluation of the adequacy and effectiveness of child protective services, determining whether to endorse the report on the evaluation, and exercising discretion over whether to propose legislation to implement the findings and recommendations from the report on the evaluation of the department, the committee has actual, specific, and unambiguous statutory responsibility for the provision of child protective services in the immediate circumstances before this court. Therefore, each member of the committee literally meets and satisfies the plain meaning of the words, quote, a legislative official with responsibility for child protective services as set forth in 22 MRSA Section 4008, subparagraph 3D. Thus mandating disclosure to the committee consistent with its enabling statute. It is therefore axiomatic that the committee constitutes a body of legislative officials that could need the department's confidential information to carry out its responsibilities to protect children from abuse and neglect. Quote, it is the proper duty of a legislative body to look diligently into every affair of government. It is meant to be the eyes and the voice and to embody the wisdom and will of its constituents. Unless the legislature has used every means of acquainting itself with the acts and the disposition of the administrative agents of the government, the state must be helpless to learn how it is being served. Trump versus Mazars. In the instant matter, as of the time the committee issued its subpoena and then sought to enforce it, the committee had not yet received any of OPEGA's evaluations on the department's handling of investigations regarding the 4 deceased children to supplement the report on Child Protective Services investigations, or 2, the final phase of the comprehensive review, an evaluation report on protecting child safety, reunification, and permanency. Thus, the committee would not have been in a position to discern whether it needed access to the confidential files in order to determine whether to fully endorse in part, or withhold endorsement of the reports or proposed legislation based on them. The judgment, therefore, should be affirmed on these grounds rather than those set forth in the court's opinion. Accordingly, although I affirm the denial of the request to compel compliance with the subpoena at issue here, I do not believe that this ruling precludes the future issuance of a subpoena for the confidential child protection records, or, if necessary, the filing of a motion to compel compliance with such a subpoena, so long as the committee is taking such action in order to review and determine whether it endorses OPEGA's reports and determine what, if any, legislation to propose to implement OPEGA's findings and recommendations. Despite the circuitous nature of the authority to access confidential information fashioned by the legislature at issue here, the committee nonetheless has that authority and may bring it to bear in appropriate circumstances. And the final footnote of the concurring opinion reads as follows: given the gulf between the views on this point expressed in the court's opinion and this concurrence, the legislature may well want to consider clarifying the scope of the committee's authority to access confidential information in these circumstances. End quote. And so, Madam President, women and men of the Senate, LD 127 seeks to do exactly what both the majority opinion's conclusion and the concurring opinion's conclusions have asked us to do. And only we can do it. And so it is obvious the Maine Law Court decision recognized our authority to define our own roles and responsibilities and determine how so. The underlying question of how an organization, in this case a co-equal branch of government, typically operates in the organizational behavior management space went unanswered. The executive branch's refusal to allow Government Oversight Committee members to access the underlying child protective case files laid bare the chasm between the office of the legislative body having access and conducting its investigation and the office's supervisory body, in this case, the committee itself, having no access to validate the veracity of the office's work or the conclusions it has reached. In a system where management is unable to improve organizational behavior through employee performance, productivity, or even culture by means of the traditional pillars of people, structure, technology, and environment, due to the flaws in the construction, recognition, or execution of any pillar, the system is at risk of failure. One of these potential failures is the lack of data or measurement. Without proper metrics, verification of data, or even missing institutional knowledge, management cannot determine whether underlying functions and processes are working or the people executing those functions are doing so properly. In essence, the executive branch, and by extension the judicial branch, have at most interfered with the legislature's management function, or at the very least, exposed its defects. In the case of institutional knowledge, the law court decision also did not take into account how the Government Oversight Committee's role and responsibility has changed over the last 20 years since its inception. Legislative oversight has evolved both at the state level in many states and nationally. In fact, even the process by which OPEGA conducts its work has evolved with the advent and use of new technology. Unfortunately, the statutes by which both the GOC and OPEGA operate have not. Many of the processes initiated in 2004 are much different today, and the significance of the sheer amount of taxpayer dollars involved has only grown, as have the methods and techniques of those wishing to defraud or waste government resources. If the primary goal of legislative oversight is to ensure the executive branch implements laws effectively, efficiently, and in accordance with legislative intent, and serve as a vital check and balance against executive excesses, and to promote accountability, investigation into agency operations, policy implementation, and the potential for scandal is the primary tool to accomplish it. Madam President, women and men of the Senate, I do believe that Report A, the majority report, which is the only bipartisan report in front of us, and it also includes the endorsement of the only tribal member on the committee, is the best way to ensure that we reassert our power to do the job that the people of the state of Maine have sent us here to do. And so, Madam President, women of the Senate, I would urge us to vote down this particular motion and move to the one that actually does something, because this one does not. When I was before the Judiciary Committee, Madam President, women and men of the Senate, I was told that the death of children in state custody, the harm of children to children in state custody, was something that I took to personally. And I'll tell you what, I do take it personally because I was in state custody. And I was one of the lucky ones because I got out of it, I survived it, and I like to say I thrived it. And I don't know what the percentages are, but for the last quarter of a century, I have worked as an adult adoptee with other adult adoptees and other people caught up in the child welfare system to see if there was a way that we could heal some of these primal wounds that we have when we are separated from the people who brought us into the world, Madam President. So yeah, I take it seriously, and I wish we all did, personally. I will also say that in Maine, the people who feel abused, the families who feel abused by what happens in the Department of Health and Human Services are so desperate for us to do something about it, and they've been following this from start to finish, that they send me confidential records, which got all kinds of private information in it, and sometimes I wish I didn't see most of it. And I'm grateful to the families who send it to me, because what they're telling me is that they trust me. They trust me to keep their private information private. But they're desperate in their entrusting this information to me because they think that I can wave a magic wand and make it all go away. And I've been gathering these files over the years, and I can't talk about it with my colleagues on the Government Oversight Committee or with anyone here, to find solutions to the problems that exist, and there are myriad problems that exist, hiding behind confidentiality to cover up secrecy doesn't bode well for the children that we are responsible for taking care of. So yeah, I take it personally. And I will tell you that if I could tell you what I've seen in some of these files, it would make your hair rise up without a whole lot of effort. And so as I listen to the debate today, I feel as though a part of it has our priorities all mixed up. We're worried about some future harm to some entity, but we have presently not just children dying in state custody, but being tortured. And the people who are doing the torturing are not held accountable for it. I wish we trusted each other more than we do. We have no faith in our ability to perform our duties because we are quote unquote political actors. I always wanted to be on the Government Oversight Committee because I believe that oversight is where the rubber meets the road. We can pass any law in here we want, but if it's not implemented with our intentions, it means nothing. And so, I will simply stop here and say, if we cannot begin to have some faith in our ability to perform our constitutional duties, which require that we have access to confidential records and information when we need it in order to do that, we may as well disband and go home and let the executive branch run everything. Thank you, Madam President.
The chair recognizes the